In the year 1347, something unseen arrived on the shores of Europe, carried not by armies, not by kings, but by silence. Within just a few years, entire cities would fall quiet, streets would empty, and nearly 1/3 of a continent's population would vanish. But this was not just a story of death. It was a story of connection between humans, animals, and an invisible force that would reshape history forever. What began as a whisper would become one of the most devastating events humanity has ever faced. At the center of this catastrophe was a microscopic organism, Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that lived quietly among wild animals for centuries, unnoticed, undisturbed. But nature does not exist in isolation. Through trade routes stretching across continents, through ships filled with goods and life, something changed. A tiny parasite, feeding on infected animals, became the bridge between species. And with a single bite, the balance between life and death began to collapse. This was more than a disease. It was a zoonotic chain, a deadly interaction between animals and humans. Rats traveled with merchants. Fleas traveled with rats. And unknowingly, humans became the final link in a fatal network. In a world without modern science, without understanding of bacteria or transmission, fear spread faster than the disease itself. And as the plague moved from port to city, from village to empire, humanity faced a terrifying truth. We are never as separate from nature as we believe. The Black Death was not just a moment in history. It was a turning point. It changed economies, shattered beliefs, and forced humanity to confront its own vulnerability. But perhaps its most powerful lesson is this: the smallest forces in nature can reshape the fate of the world. And sometimes, history is not written by kings or wars, but by things we cannot even see. In 1347, something invisible arrived in Europe, not with armies, not with thunder, but with silence. It slipped through ports and marketplaces, hidden within the ordinary rhythm of life. Ships docked, goods were unloaded, and no one noticed that death had already stepped ashore. Within just a few years, the unthinkable would happen. 1 out of every 3 people would be gone. Entire families erased, villages abandoned, and cities transformed into echoes of what they once were. But this was not just a human tragedy. It did not begin in crowded streets or royal courts. It began far from human eyes. In the wild, among animals, in ecosystems that had existed in balance for centuries. At the center of this unfolding catastrophe was a microscopic force, Yersinia pestis, moving silently through nature, waiting for the right moment to cross into the human world. The chain was simple and deadly. Rats traveled with merchants across continents. Fleas fed on those rats, carrying the infection within them. And when hunger struck, those fleas turned to humans. A single bite, that was all it took. No warning, no understanding. Just a quiet transfer from animal to human, from nature to civilization. Trade routes, once symbols of connection and prosperity, became pathways of destruction. From the distant steppes of Central Asia to the crowded ports of the Mediterranean, the disease followed the flow of commerce. What connected the world also exposed it. And for the first time in history, an invisible enemy would move faster than human understanding. This was the Black Death, a pandemic that did not just kill millions, but reshaped societies, shattered beliefs, and revealed a terrifying truth. Humanity is never separate from nature, only temporarily spared from it. Long before it reached the cities of Europe, long before fear took hold of human minds, the Black Death already existed, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a quiet presence in the natural world. Hidden deep within the vast grasslands of Central Asia, the bacterium known as Yersinia pestis had been circulating among wild animal populations for centuries. It did not begin with humans. It did not need humans. Nature had already given it a home. In these remote regions, small mammals, especially rodents, served as its primary hosts. Among them, one species would play a critical role in changing the course of human history: the black rat. These animals lived close to one another, thriving in dense colonies, creating the perfect environment for the bacteria to spread silently and efficiently. But the true agents of transmission were even smaller, almost invisible to the human eye: fleas. Fleas fed on the blood of infected rodents, ingesting the bacteria along with it. Inside the flea's body, something extraordinary and deadly happened. The bacteria multiplied rapidly, blocking the flea's digestive system. Starving and desperate, the flea began to bite again and again, unable to feed properly. And when its natural hosts began to die, the flea searched for a new source of blood. That source became humans. This was not an invasion. It was a shift. A biological accident shaped by ecology, movement, and survival. The disease had always existed, quietly cycling through animal populations without global consequence. But once it found a bridge into the human world, everything changed. What makes this story so unsettling is its simplicity. There was no intention, no design, only interaction. Animals, parasites, and humans connected through trade, proximity, and chance. And in that connection lies a powerful truth. Nature does not recognize the boundaries we create. It does not distinguish between wild and civilized, between forest and city. The Black Death did not emerge because nature failed. It emerged because nature continued, exactly as it always had. There is a moment in history when a disease stops being part of nature and becomes part of us. That moment is called a zoonotic spillover, the instant when an infection crosses from animals into humans. In modern science, this process is known as zoonosis. And in the case of the Black Death, it was not a single event, but a chain reaction. It began with a bite. A flea, already infected, driven by hunger, searching for blood. When it bit a human, it did not simply feed, it transmitted a deadly bacterium into the bloodstream. There were no symptoms at first, no warning signs. Just a microscopic invasion, quietly spreading through the body. And by the time the human host realized something was wrong, it was already too late. But this was not happening in isolation. Across continents, trade routes were alive with movement: silk, spices, metals, and something far more dangerous. Ships carried goods, merchants, and hidden passengers. Deep within the wooden structures of these ships, black rats thrived. Invisible to the human eye, they moved between cargo, feeding, nesting, multiplying. Now imagine a ship drifting across the sea. No alarms, no visible threat, just the sound of waves against wood and wind filling the sails. But below deck, something else was happening. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried the infection. And within that silence, death was already traveling. When the ship finally reached port, it did not arrive empty. It brought with it an invisible network, a living chain of transmission. Rats disembarked, fleas searched for new hosts, and the disease stepped onto land unnoticed. This is what made the Black Death so unstoppable. It was not spread by intention, but by ordinary life. Trade, movement, survival, these were the forces that carried it forward. And in that reality lies something deeply unsettling. The greatest threats are not always the ones we can see, but the ones we unknowingly carry with us. By the mid-14th century, the disease was no longer confined to distant lands. It had begun its approach toward Europe, not as an invasion of armies, but as a consequence of connection. Trade routes had already done their work. Now, history was about to change. The turning point came during a brutal conflict known as the Siege of Kaffa. In 1346, Mongol forces surrounded the fortified port city of Kaffa, a vital hub controlled by Genoese merchants on the Black Sea. But something unexpected began to happen inside the Mongol camps. Soldiers started to fall ill. Fever spread. Death followed quickly. What happened next would become one of the earliest recorded examples of biological warfare. As the disease ravaged their army, the Mongols made a desperate and terrifying decision. They catapulted the bodies of infected soldiers over the city walls. Decaying corpses, filled with disease, landed inside Kaffa, and with them, the plague entered the city. Inside the walls, panic began to grow. The people of Kaffa did not understand what they were facing. Illness spread rapidly. Fear spread even faster, and those who could escape did. Genoese merchants fled the city, boarding ships in desperation, hoping to outrun the invisible threat. But they were not escaping the plague. They were carrying it. Those ships crossed the Black Sea and entered the Mediterranean, eventually reaching the ports of Sicily. When they arrived in 1347, something was already terribly wrong. Sailors were sick. Some were dying. Others were already dead. The ships were turned away, but it was too late. The disease had already stepped onto European soil. From that moment on, nothing could stop it. What began in a distant siege, in a moment of fear and desperation, had now become a continental catastrophe. And Europe, without knowing it, had just opened its doors to one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Once the Black Death entered Europe, it did not move slowly. It did not wait. It did not pause. It spread with terrifying speed. From the ports of Sicily in 1347, the disease began to radiate outward, following the arteries of trade and human movement. Within months, it reached mainland Italy. Within a year, it had spread across France, Spain, and parts of North Africa. And by 1351, nearly all of Europe had been touched by its shadow. If we could look at a map of Europe during those years, we would not see borders or kingdoms. We would see a wave. A dark, advancing front moving from south to north, from coastlines to inland towns, from cities to the most isolated villages. Every road, every market, every ship became a pathway. There was no safe distance, no refuge beyond its reach. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that between 30 to 50% of Europe's population died in just 4 years. Entire communities disappeared. In some regions, there were not enough living people left to bury the dead. Mass graves became common, churches overflowed, and the rituals of death themselves began to collapse under the sheer scale of loss. But beyond the numbers, there were moments that revealed the true horror of the plague. People who were healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. Families who shared a meal together were gone within days. There was no time to understand, no time to prepare, only time to fear. In some cities, the devastation was so complete that they were effectively erased from history. Homes stood empty. Streets fell silent. Life simply stopped. Survivors lived surrounded by absence, neighbors gone, families broken, entire worlds reduced to memory. And as the plague advanced, it carried more than disease. It carried despair, a growing realization that this was not a temporary crisis, but something far beyond human control. The Black Death did not just spread across Europe. It consumed it. At first, it did not look like death. It began quietly, with a fever, a sudden chill, followed by waves of heat that the body could not control. Victims felt weak, disoriented, as if something inside them had already begun to fail. There were no clear answers, no understanding, only the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Then came the swelling, painful, unnatural enlargements of the lymph nodes known today as buboes appearing in the neck, under the arms, and in the groin. This form of the disease, the most common, would later be called the bubonic plague. The swellings grew dark, inflamed, and extremely tender, a visible sign that the body was losing its battle from within. As the infection spread through the bloodstream, the symptoms became even more horrifying. Dark patches began to appear on the skin-blackened areas, caused by internal bleeding beneath the surface. It is from these marks that the pandemic would earn its name, the Black Death. At the same time, victims suffered from severe headaches, vomiting, and in many cases, coughing up blood. What made the disease truly terrifying was its speed. From the first signs of illness, death could come within just 2 to 7 days. There was no effective treatment, no medicine, no understanding of what could stop it. A person could fall ill one day and be gone before the week ended. To those living through it, the body itself became something unfamiliar, something hostile. Every symptom was a warning, every pain a signal of approaching death. And yet, there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Black Death was not just a disease you could see. It was a disease you could feel, taking over step by step until nothing remained. As the Black Death spread across Europe, it did more than destroy bodies. It shattered understanding. People were not only facing death, they were facing the unknown. There was no science to explain what was happening, no clear cause, no visible enemy. And in that void of knowledge, the human mind did what it has always done when confronted with fear. It searched for meaning. For many, the answer was divine punishment. Across towns and cities, people believed the plague was a sign of gods, a punishment for sin, a warning to humanity. Public acts of repentance became common. Groups known as flagellants marched through the streets, whipping themselves in an attempt to atone, believing that suffering might bring mercy. But not all responses were inward. As fear grew, so did suspicion, and suspicion quickly turned into blame. Communities began to look for anyone to hold responsible for the catastrophe unfolding around them. This led to one of the darkest chapters of the Black Death. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells, spreading disease intentionally. There was no evidence, no logic, only fear, and that fear ignited violence. Entire communities were attacked, displaced, or not by disease, but by their neighbors. At the same time, accusations of witchcraft began to rise. Those who were different, isolated, or simply unlucky became targets. Women, the elderly, and the marginalized were often blamed for forces no one could understand. The plague did not just reveal the limits of human knowledge, it exposed the fragility of social trust. What we see in these reactions is not just history. It is human nature under pressure. When faced with uncertainty, fear demands answers. And when answers cannot be found, they are created often at a terrible cost. The Black Death was not only a biological crisis, it was a psychological one, a social one, a moment when fear reshaped reality and turned people against each other. When the Black Death began to fade, it did not leave behind the same world it had entered. What remained was not just loss, but transformation. Europe was no longer the society it once was. The foundations of its economy, its power structures, and its way of life had all been shaken, perhaps permanently. One of the most immediate and profound changes was the collapse of the labor force. With millions dead, fields were left unworked, workshops stood empty, and entire industries slowed to a halt. For the first time in generations, labor became scarce. And with scarcity came power. Survivors, especially peasants and workers, found themselves in a position they had never known before. They could demand higher wages. They could choose where to work. In some regions, they could even refuse oppressive conditions that had once been unavoidable. The balance between landowners and laborers began to shift. This shift struck at the very core of the feudal system. For centuries, feudalism had depended on a rigid hierarchy: lords, land, and labor bound together in an unchanging structure. But now, that structure was breaking. As workers gained mobility and leverage, the authority of the nobility weakened. The old order could no longer sustain itself. At the same time, something else was beginning to grow. With fewer people and more available resources, wealth became more concentrated among survivors. Education, art, and intellectual life slowly began to expand. In the aftermath of devastation, a new curiosity about the world and humanity's place within it started to emerge. Historians would later look back and see this period not only as an end, but as a beginning. The conditions created by the Black Death helped lay the groundwork for one of the most remarkable periods in human history, the Renaissance. A time of rebirth, innovation, and rediscovery. This is the paradox of the Black Death. It destroyed millions of lives, yet it also reshaped the future. Because sometimes, history does not move forward in moments of stability, but in the aftermath of collapse. Although centuries have passed since the Black Death, its legacy has not disappeared. It has evolved quietly, continuously, into the modern world we live in today. The structures have changed, the science has advanced, but the fundamental relationship between humans, animals, and disease remains strikingly familiar. In the modern era, humanity has faced new pandemics that echo the past in unexpected ways. One of the most significant examples is COVID-19, a disease that, like the Black Death, spread rapidly across borders, disrupted economies, and exposed how deeply connected and vulnerable the world has become. What both events reveal is not just the existence of disease, but the speed of connection. In the 14th century, trade routes carried infection across continents over months and years. Today, global travel and digital connectivity can carry pathogens across the planet in hours. The world has become faster, but also more tightly linked than ever before. This is where the concept of zoonotic disease becomes critically important. New infections continue to emerge from the interaction between humans and animal ecosystems. As populations expand and natural habitats shrink, these encounters become more frequent and more unpredictable. The boundary between human space and animal space is becoming increasingly blurred. And within this reality lies a difficult truth. Globalization has brought unprecedented progress, but it has also created new pathways for rapid spread. What once required ships and months of travel can now happen through a single flight, a single city, a single moment of contact. The lesson of the Black Death is not simply historical. It is structural. It reminds us that systems of connection, trade, travel, communication, are never neutral. They amplify both prosperity and risk. And perhaps the most important question it leaves us with is this: in a world disconnected, are we more protected than ever before or more exposed? History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes, especially when the conditions remain familiar. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a turning point in human history. It redefined societies, reshaped economies, and altered the course of civilizations forever. What began as an invisible presence in nature became a force that exposed the deepest vulnerabilities of humanity and its capacity to adapt, rebuild, and transform. And in the end, its story is not only about death, it is about connection between humans and animals, between nature and society, between chance and consequence. And it all began with a tiny bite. But unlike many chapters of history, this story did not end in the past. The bacterium at its center, Yersinia pestis, never truly disappeared. It still exists today, quietly circulating in certain animal populations, especially wild rodents, in different parts of the world. The difference is not elimination, but control. Modern medicine has transformed what was once a near-certain death sentence into a treatable bacterial infection. With early diagnosis, antibiotics can now effectively stop the disease from progressing. Treatment strategies have evolved dramatically since the Middle Ages, moving from superstition and isolation to precise microbiological intervention. Today, plague cases still appear, but they are rare, localized, and closely monitored by global health systems. Outbreaks are typically contained quickly thanks to rapid detection methods, improved sanitation, and coordinated public health responses. Yet the most important shift is not only medical, it is scientific understanding. We now know how transmission works. We understand the role of vectors, such as fleas and rodents. We recognize zoonotic pathways and actively monitor them to prevent future spillovers. Still, the presence of plague in nature serves as a quiet reminder. It tells us that history is not fully behind us. It is layered beneath the surface of the present, waiting in ecological systems that continue to evolve. Modern humanity is no longer helpless against the Black Death, but it remains responsible for understanding the systems that once allowed it to rise. And perhaps that is the final lesson this story leaves behind. The greatest advantage of the modern world is not that we have escaped nature, but that we have finally begun to understand it. Before you leave, take a moment to reflect on the story you've just experienced. History is not only something we read, it is something we learn from, something that continues to shape the world we live in today. If you found value in this journey, consider subscribing and joining this channel. Every story here is crafted to explore the hidden connections between science, history, and humanity. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. What part of this story impacted you the most? Your perspective helps shape future episodes. And if you enjoyed this video, a like would truly support the growth of this channel and help more people discover these stories. There are more journeys waiting, deeper stories, forgotten events, and powerful lessons from the past. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care of your health, stay curious, and appreciate the fragile balance that keeps life moving forward.